You've probably heard people talk about levels of awareness in a way that makes it sound gradual, almost reassuring, like something you grow into over time, something that expands your understanding without really disrupting your life. That's not the level Jung was pointing to. What he identified was something much more specific, a threshold that very few people actually reach and even fewer manage to sustain, not because it's inaccessible, but because the moment you stabilize in that level of perception, it starts to interfere with how you function in real situations. Not emotionally, structurally. And the first place you notice it isn't in your thoughts. It's in your interactions. Conversations that used to flow begin to stall in subtle ways, not because something obvious went wrong, but because you can see where they are going before they get there. And once you see that, responding the same way requires you to ignore what is already clear. Most people do exactly that. They adjust, they smooth things over, they keep the interaction moving, because maintaining that flow is what keeps relationships stable. That's how it holds. But if that adjustment stops, even briefly, the structure starts to break. And once it starts breaking, it doesn't do it all at once. It shows up in small moments. A pause that lasts too long. A response that doesn't come. A conversation that ends earlier than it should. Nothing dramatic, but enough. And that's where most people don't realize what's actually happening. Because what's changing isn't the situation. It's your participation in it. And once that shifts, everything built on that participation starts to destabilize in ways that are difficult to reverse. That's the part most people never stay in. Because the moment you do, something starts to change in ways you can't easily undo. You see it first in conversations that used to require no effort at all. Situations that used to feel completely ordinary, like someone explaining something, telling a story, or justifying a decision, where nothing in the words is obviously wrong, yet something underneath it doesn't hold anymore. And once that becomes visible, continuing the conversation the same way requires you to ignore what is already clear. That's where the shift begins to interfere. Because you don't interrupt the interaction and you don't confront the person, but you also stop reinforcing what is being said. And without that reinforcement, the exchange loses the structure it depended on to stay stable. At first, the change is subtle, but it doesn't remain subtle for long, since the other person starts repeating the same point, adjusting their tone, or adding emphasis in an attempt to recover the flow that used to exist. And when that still doesn't work, the interaction begins to strain in a way that wasn't there before. This is where most people misunderstand what's happening, interpreting it as distance or disinterest, when in reality what has changed is your ability to participate in something that no longer feels structurally coherent. That difference matters more than it seems. Because once your perception starts tracking structure instead of content, every interaction that depends on distortion, omission, or performance begins to degrade in the same way, and that degradation does not remain isolated. It repeats, across different people, different contexts, different environments, until a consistent pattern becomes impossible to ignore. Conversations stall where they used to resolve, interactions demand effort where they used to feel automatic, and relationships begin to carry a level of friction that didn't exist before. And once that pattern stabilizes, returning to the previous way of engaging stops being a neutral option. You can reproduce the old responses, and you can approximate the old behavior, but the moment you are aware that you are doing that, the interaction is already different. That's the pressure most people avoid, because staying in it forces something else to happen. What changes next isn't behavior. It's how perception itself begins to operate. What's changing at this stage is not your attitude or your personality, but the level at which your perception is operating. And once that level shifts, the way you process interactions stops being guided by what is presented on the surface and starts being driven by whether the structure underneath actually holds. Before, Most of your responses were organized around content, tone, and context, which allowed interactions to function smoothly even when there were inconsistencies present, because those inconsistencies remained outside your active attention. That stops being possible. Your attention moves toward alignment, toward whether what is being said matches what is actually happening, and once that becomes the reference point, continuing to respond in the same way requires you to override something you are clearly perceiving in real time. That's where the break begins to consolidate. Because you are no longer fully inside the interaction, you are processing it as it unfolds, and that shift changes your role whether you intend to or not, since every response now carries the influence of what you can see but are choosing not to ignore. At first, this only affects specific moments, but the effect does not remain contained. Each time you avoid reinforcing something that doesn't hold, each time you choose not to adjust your response just to preserve the flow, each time you allow an interaction to resolve without artificially stabilizing it, you move further away from the pattern that previously made those interactions coherent. That distance accumulates, not dramatically, but consistently, until returning to the previous way of engaging would require more effort than continuing forward, because going back would mean ignoring what you are already able to recognize as it happens. That is where the shift becomes effectively irreversible. You can still simulate the old behavior when necessary, and you can still reproduce the surface of the interaction in specific contexts, but maintaining that consistently introduces a contradiction between what you perceive and how you respond, and over time that contradiction becomes more disruptive than the friction you were trying to avoid in the first place. This is why most people do not remain in this level, not because they fail to reach it, but because sustaining it demands a consistency that directly interferes with the mechanisms that keep interactions stable. And when those mechanisms begin to fail, the natural response is to recalibrate perception to a level that restores compatibility. And that recalibration works. It brings back flow, predictability, and a sense of ease that feels familiar. But it does so by reducing precision. And once you have experienced perception operating with that level of clarity, reducing it no longer feels like adaptation. It feels like distortion. That is the trade most people make. And it doesn't stay internal. This is usually where other people start reacting to something they don't understand. Not all at once, and not in ways that are easy to explain, but in small shifts that repeat often enough to make the difference impossible to ignore. What used to happen naturally in conversations starts requiring effort. Not because people changed, but because the interaction depends on responses you no longer produce automatically. And without those responses, the exchange loses the rhythm that once kept it moving. At first, this shows up in moments that seem insignificant on their own, like a conversation that ends earlier than expected, a pause that isn't filled the way it used to be, or a response that feels incomplete even though nothing obvious is missing. Nothing dramatic. But it repeats. And over time, that repetition begins to affect how entire relationships function, especially with people who rely on predictable patterns to maintain connection. With them, the interaction starts to feel demanding in a way that is difficult to explain, not because of what is being said explicitly, but because of what is required implicitly to keep the exchange stable. And the more consistently those expectations are not met, the more the relationship begins to lose coherence. Some people respond by increasing pressure, repeating themselves, adding emphasis, or pushing for clarity in an attempt to restore what used to work, while others begin to withdraw as the interaction stops providing the familiarity they depend on. Neither response resolves the problem, because what they are reacting to is not a behavior they can correct, but the absence of a pattern they no longer know how to restore. That's when the shift becomes visible beyond isolated moments. The number of interactions that feel effortless begins to decrease. The amount of effort required to maintain certain relationships increases, and the environments where you can engage without internal contradiction become more limited and more specific over time. This narrowing is not a preference. It's a consequence. Because once your participation is no longer driven by automatic alignment with existing patterns, every interaction depends on whether those patterns can hold under direct awareness, and in most cases they don't. And when that becomes consistent, a realization starts to take shape that most people resist for as long as possible. You don't fit the same way anymore. Not socially, structurally. And that's where most explanations begin to fail. Because what's happening here doesn't fit the way people are used to explaining themselves. Carl Jung did not treat this as a matter of personality or surface behavior, but as a change in how perception organizes itself, something that alters not only how a person experiences reality, but what they are able to remain connected to once that level is reached. What he identified was not a type in the conventional sense, but a recurring configuration, a pattern of perception and psychological intensity that produces the same outcome across different lives, regardless of context. The individuals who carried this configuration were not simply more sensitive. They were operating with a level of awareness that made certain forms of participation unsustainable, especially in environments that depend on unconscious alignment to function, and that changes how the previous experience needs to be interpreted. Because what looked like difficulty is not actually failure. What looked like distance is not withdrawal. What looked like incompatibility is not rejection. It is selection. A process in which perception begins to filter what can and cannot be sustained, not based on preference, but based on whether the interaction can hold under direct awareness. And that process is not neutral. It removes as much as it reveals. Jung never used the term indigo empath, but what is now described under that name reflects this same configuration, not as an identity to adopt, but as a consequence of what happens when awareness reaches a level that reorganizes what remains possible. And once that process begins to stabilize, the question is no longer whether something is wrong. The question becomes what is left when everything that cannot hold is no longer maintained. And that answer doesn't come as clarity. It shows up in the way your life starts to reorganize around what you no longer ignore. What remains after that filtering process doesn't appear as a clear answer. It shows up in the way your routine starts to change through decisions that didn't used to feel like decisions. You notice it when a conversation no longer needs to reach a conclusion for you to understand it, and staying engaged past that point begins to feel unnecessary in a way that is difficult to justify to the other person without creating friction. You notice it in situations where you are expected to respond the same way you always did, but the response doesn't come with the same ease, because producing it now requires a level of adjustment that you are fully aware of while it's happening. It becomes visible in environments where everything seems to be functioning normally, yet the interaction depends on a version of you that no longer appears automatically, and maintaining that version starts to feel like effort rather than participation. That is where anticipation begins to change your behavior. Before entering certain situations, you already know how they will unfold, what will be expected from you, and how much adjustment will be required to keep the interaction stable, and that awareness starts influencing your decisions before anything even happens. You begin declining things you would have accepted without thinking. You leave earlier than you used to, not because you are tired, but because you recognize the point where staying longer would require you to override what you are perceiving in order to remain engaged. You become more selective with your time and attention, not as a preference, but as a response to the cumulative effect of repeatedly having to adjust yourself to maintain interactions that no longer sustain themselves naturally. And over time, that accumulation reshapes your life in ways that are difficult to reverse. The number of environments where you can participate without internal adjustment becomes smaller. The interactions that feel natural become more specific, and the effort required to maintain alignment in everything else becomes increasingly visible. From the outside, it can look like distance. From the inside, it feels like precision. And that precision didn't start now. It started much earlier, in moments you probably didn't know how to interpret at the time. Most of it begins much earlier, in situations that seemed ordinary at the time but carried a level of perception you didn't yet have the language to understand. You might remember moments where something felt off without any clear reason, not in a dramatic way, but in the kind of quiet misalignment that doesn't match what everyone else is responding to, like noticing tension between people who were acting as if nothing was wrong, or sensing that someone speaking with authority wasn't grounded in what they were saying. There was no framework for that. So you adjusted, not consciously at first, but consistently enough that the adjustment became automatic, because responding in alignment with what you were actually perceiving would have created friction you didn't know how to handle. That's where the distortion begins. Not in perception, in response. Because the more often you override what you notice in order to stay connected, the more natural that override starts to feel, until eventually the original perception begins to look like the problem instead of the adjustment itself. And that inversion stays. It follows you into later relationships, into environments where something still doesn't hold but appears functional enough that questioning it creates more disruption than accepting it. And over time you begin to reduce what you express, not because it isn't there, but because expressing it consistently produces outcomes you've already learned to avoid. That reduction accumulates, quietly, until what you actually perceive and what you allow yourself to acknowledge no longer match in a stable way. And when that gap becomes consistent, the interpretation shifts. Not outward, inward. You start assuming the excess is yours, that you are reading too much, that you are reacting too strongly, that what you are noticing doesn't carry the weight it seems to have. That's the part that stays the longest. Not the perception, the doubt around it. And that doubt doesn't stay passive. Most people won't see this happening. They'll think you're pulling away. They'll assume something changed in you. They won't recognize that what actually changed is what you can no longer ignore. This is where it starts affecting how your life actually functions. At a certain point, this stops feeling like something you are going through and starts to feel like something that is defining the conditions under which your life can operate. Not in theory, in practice. Because the range of situations where you can remain fully engaged without adjustment is no longer wide enough to ignore, and every attempt to expand it by forcing yourself back into familiar patterns quickly reveals the same limitation. It doesn't hold. What used to feel like flexibility begins to look like compromise, and what once felt like adaptation starts to resemble a gradual loss of clarity, which makes the idea of returning less appealing the more you understand what would be required to sustain it. This is where most people try to find a middle ground, a way to maintain awareness while still participating in everything the same way. It doesn't work. Not consistently. Because the moment awareness is reduced enough to restore compatibility, it stops being the same awareness, and the moment it is held fully, the same patterns begin to break again. There is no stable version where both are maintained, and trying to hold both comes at a cost, because that tension doesn't stay contained. That is the part that takes time to accept. Not because it is difficult to understand, because it is difficult to live with. Carl Jung recognized this long before it was given any modern interpretation, not as a problem to solve, but as a consequence of what happens when perception reaches a level that reorganizes what can and cannot be sustained. What is now described as the Indigo empath reflects that same pattern, not as an identity to adopt, as a condition that changes what remains possible. And once that becomes clear, the question is no longer whether something is wrong or whether it can be fixed. The question becomes what you are willing to maintain, and what you are no longer able to pretend not to see. Because at that level, The process does not reverse in the way most people expect. It refines. And what it leaves behind is not a simplified version of your life. It is a more selective one. When this continues without being understood, it doesn't remain contained, because trying to maintain both sides at once, what you see and what you actually act on, creates a tension that does not resolve through adjustment. At first, it feels manageable. You compensate. You adapt. You find ways to stay engaged without fully aligning with what is happening. But that balance doesn't hold, because each situation requires the same internal split. And over time that repetition turns into something cumulative rather than situational. That's where the strain begins to show. Not externally at first. Internally. A growing sense that certain environments require more from you than they used to, not in effort, but in how much of your perception has to be set aside in order to remain functional within them. That cost builds. Not suddenly, but in a way that becomes harder to ignore the longer it continues, until maintaining that split starts to affect how you experience things that once felt neutral. You begin to disengage without fully deciding to. You lose interest in conversations that follow patterns you can already see. You feel disconnected in environments that still look the same on the surface, but no longer hold the same way underneath. And without a clear explanation, this shift is easy to misinterpret as fatigue, as burnout, as detachment. But those labels don't address what is actually happening. Because the issue is not that something stopped working. It's that what you are perceiving no longer allows you to participate in the same way without creating a contradiction you can feel while it's happening. And that contradiction does not stabilize. It accumulates until something gives. And once it does, going back isn't as simple as it seems. Very few people stay here. Not because they don't reach it, but because once the consequences become real, most choose to step back into patterns that make life easier to manage. That option remains available. It always does. You can go back to responding the way you used to. You can smooth things over again. You can participate without questioning what holds the interaction together. It works. Until it doesn't. Because once you've seen how it actually functions, maintaining it requires something different. Not effort. Suppression. And that's the part most people won't sustain. So they adjust. Gradually. Quietly. Until the friction disappears and everything starts to feel normal again. But something else disappears with it. And once you've experienced that level of clarity, losing it doesn't feel like relief. It feels like reduction. That's why so few people remain. Not because they can't reach it. Because staying means letting everything that doesn't hold fall.